Chapter 1. When Rome ran on gears, sweat, and wine. Hey guys! Tonight, we're gliding back, slowly, to a time when sandals were the height of fashion, plumbing was somehow both miraculous and disgusting, and engineers thought nothing of carving entire mountains just to move a bit of water. So, dim the lights, maybe pull that blanket a little higher, let your phone rest beside you, and let's drift into the world of the Roman Empire, an empire that built more, broke more, and bragged more than almost anyone else in history. You know, the Romans had this reputation. They weren't inventors in the modern sense. They didn't come up with the steam engine or discover electricity. What they were, however, was aggressively practical. They saw something clever and said, "Nice? Let's make 10,000 of those and tax them." So tonight, we're not talking about wars or Caesars stabbing each other in togas. We're talking about the strange, surprisingly advanced, and sometimes absurdly over-engineered tech of ancient Rome. The machines, gadgets, and clever contraptions that made their world hum along. Let's start, gently, with water. Because apparently, that's how you measure civilization in the ancient world. Who could get clean water without dying of dysentery? The Roman obsession with water. The Romans adored water the way influencers adore ring lights. It was everywhere, and they couldn't stop showing it off. Their aqueducts weren't just pipes, they were declarations of dominance. Imagine being a conquered Gaul, watching this endless stone snake crawl across valleys and mountains just to deliver water to some senator's bath. It must have been like watching aliens build a spa on your farm. And these aqueducts worked. Some stretched over 50 miles, relying entirely on gravity and math done by men wearing sandals and probably arguing in Latin. They built them with such precision that the slope could be less than 1 inch per 100 feet, and it still worked flawlessly. Inside the city, the water was sorted into a class system, naturally. Public fountains for the plebs, private taps for the rich, and of course, the famous Roman baths, where everyone went to soak, gossip, and quietly judge each other's sandals. The pipes? Which, yes, is a bit of a problem in hindsight. People like to joke that Rome fell because of lead poisoning. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But it's hard to deny that pumping water through a literal neurotoxin wasn't their best idea. Still, the engineering behind it, brass taps, pressure control, underground systems, was about 1,000 years ahead of anything else in Europe. Oh, and they even had hot water. Thanks to something called the hypocaust, basically ancient underfloor heating. They'd run hot air from a furnace through little brick channels under the floors and inside the walls. You could walk barefoot on a warm marble floor in the 1st century CE, which, frankly, feels unfair for people who lived in drafty stone huts a few miles away. So yes, Rome was warm, wet, and weirdly cozy if you were rich. If you were poor, your bath was more of a philosophical concept. The automatic world of Rome. Now, you might think automatic doors started with grocery stores. But no, Rome beat us to it. Around the 1st century, a clever engineer named Hero of Alexandria, ironically, wasn't Roman but Greek, created a series of machines so advanced they sound fake. Hero invented temple doors that opened themselves when a priest lit a fire on the altar. Air pressure. Heat from the fire would push air through tubes, move water into a hidden bucket, and boom, the doors creaked open on their own. Worshippers thought it was divine power. In reality, it was early robotics powered by thermodynamics and a flair for drama. He also designed what might be the first vending machine. You drop a coin into a slot, and a measured amount of holy water would pour out. Ancient spirituality meet coin-operated convenience. Hero even described a prototype for a steam engine, the Yalopile, which was basically a spinning metal sphere that puffed steam and rotated on its axis. It didn't do much, but it proved the principle centuries before industrial Britain thought of it again. It's kind of funny to imagine that somewhere in Alexandria, a man watched this little steam ball spin and thought, "Cool party trick," then went back to building fountains. Concrete, the secret ingredient. If there's one Roman invention that basically defined their empire, it's concrete. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, is the reason their structures are still standing while modern ones sometimes crumble after 50 years. It's not magic, but it's close. They mixed volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius with lime and water, creating a chemical reaction that allowed the material to heal itself over time. Yes, self-healing concrete, invented over 2,000 years ago. Because of course they did. The Pantheon's dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, is 2,000 years old and hasn't fallen once. Meanwhile, some modern parking garages are collapsing after 30. There's something humbling about that. They even experimented with lightweight mixes, adding pumice or crushed tile depending on whether the structure needed strength or buoyancy. That's right, they built concrete that could float. They used it in harbors to create breakwaters at sea. Essentially, ancient Rome had its own version of prefabricated marine construction. And while we're here, let's not forget that all this was done without cranes powered by engines. Just pulleys, human backs, and an almost worrying sense of determination. Roads that refuse to die. We can't talk about Roman tech without mentioning their roads. You've heard the cliché, all roads lead to Rome. But honestly, they did. At least if you followed one long enough. These weren't simple dirt paths either. Roman roads were multi-layered, with gravel, crushed stone, sand, and heavy paving slabs, all arranged for drainage and endurance. You could drag an army, a cart full of marble, and probably a slightly inebriated senator down one of those roads, and it'd still be fine the next morning. The result? Over 250,000 miles of interconnected roads. For reference, that's roughly the same as circling the Earth 10 times. Roman postal couriers could travel 50 miles a day across the empire, which made communication and control eerily modern. It's no exaggeration to say that the Roman road system was the ancient version of the internet, a network that spread ideas, goods, and occasionally bad emperors. And of course, they built milestones along the way, literally numbered stones marking distance from the capital. Because the Romans liked to remind everyone that, yes, you were still part of Rome's world, even if you were currently surrounded by goats in Gaul. The madness of mechanized luxury. Now, while Roman engineers were busy moving mountains, the wealthy were busy turning those skills into ridiculous toys. For instance, Emperor Nero, history's favorite drama king, reportedly had a revolving dining room. The ceiling turned slowly, mimicking the stars above, powered by an unseen mechanism of pulleys and slaves. Because nothing says emperor of the world like eating grapes on a spinning platform. They also loved fountains that spat wine instead of water, automatic singing birds made from hydraulics, and elaborate garden mechanisms that sprayed guests when they sat down. Ancient Rome was basically an over-engineered amusement park, minus the safety regulations. And let's talk plumbing again, briefly, because it's too good. Elite Roman houses had silver faucets. Some even had multi-level heating and cold storage rooms. There were toilets with running water, flushed by streams diverted from the aqueduct. It was all very impressive, until you remember that the communal toilets were also social spaces. People would sit side by side on marble seats, chatting, sharing gossip, and occasionally sponges. Yes, sponges. On sticks. Rinsed in a trough of vinegar water. The Romans were advanced, but they weren't that advanced. The ancient industrial zones. Rome wasn't all villas and baths. If you walked along the Tiber in the 2nd century CE, you'd find what was essentially an industrial park. There were water mills grinding grain, pottery factories, shipyards, and massive warehouses stacked with amphorae full of olive oil. One particularly fascinating site, the Barbegal Mills in southern France, featured 16 water wheels arranged in a cascade, a literal power plant. It's been called the world's first industrial complex. The mills could grind enough flour daily to feed tens of thousands of people, all powered by gravity and water without a single spark plug. It's oddly modern. They even had shipping manifests, standardized weights, and quality control marks burned into goods. Bureaucracy, it seems, is eternal. The quiet fall of cleverness. And yet, here's where it all gets melancholic in that soft bedtime history kind of way. For all their brilliance, the Romans didn't pass their innovations on. When the empire fell, so did much of its knowledge. The aqueducts cracked. The mills stopped turning. The recipes for concrete vanished into monastic libraries. waiting for someone to rediscover them over 1,000 years later. It's easy to picture an abandoned bathhouse, empty, echoing, warm tiles long gone cold. A few scattered amphorae. Maybe a mosaic floor depicting Neptune, still perfect, still smug. It's a reminder that even the cleverest societies can lose their spark, not through destruction, but through disinterest. The ghosts of genius. Today, we still walk over Roman bridges. We drink from aqueducts they built. Some of their roads are now highways. The Pantheon's dome still stares up at the sky, perfectly symmetrical, smugly intact. And every time we flush a toilet or watch hot water flow from a tap, we're touching something they dreamed of 2,000 years ago, half magic, half plumbing. So tonight, as we drift off, let's leave Rome in twilight. The baths are quiet. The fountains are still. And somewhere, under layers of ash and time, Hero's little steam ball still spins, pointlessly but beautifully. Chapter 2. Scalpel, Sponge, and Superstition, the Roman Art of Medicine. Let's drift, then, from aqueducts and concrete domes into something far smaller and far more intimate, the human body. Because while the Romans could build monuments that lasted for millennia, their approach to fixing people was, let's say, creative. If you imagine a Roman doctor, picture a man with impeccable posture, a collection of polished bronze instruments, and an expression suggesting that he's about to charge you for both the cure and the diagnosis. Medicine in ancient Rome was a curious mix of scientific logic, Greek philosophy, herbal remedies, and a generous sprinkling of absolute nonsense. Yet somehow, amid the incense and leeches, they produced innovations that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance. The doctors who weren't exactly Roman. For starters, most Roman doctors weren't actually Roman. They were Greek. Because, of course, they were. Rome conquered Greece militarily, but intellectually, Greece got the last laugh. By the 1st century CE, Greek physicians dominated Roman society. The most famous of them all was Galen of Pergamon, a man who basically became the medical influencer of the next 1,400 years. Galen believed in balance, the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When one was out of order, you got sick. Simple, elegant, completely wrong. But it sounded convincing enough to last through the Middle Ages. Still, Galen wasn't just a theorist. He performed surgeries, dissected animals, and described the circulatory and nervous systems with shocking accuracy for someone who wasn't allowed to dissect humans. He also wrote so much that scholars joke his collected works could fill a small library, which, in Rome, they occasionally did. He once served as personal physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which must have been stressful. Imagine trying to prescribe rest to a man ruling the largest empire on earth, while fighting wars on 3 fronts. The tools of the trade. Roman surgical tools were stunningly advanced and disturbingly familiar. Archaeologists have found scalpels, forceps, speculums, bone drills, catheters, and even tools designed for delicate eye surgeries. If you saw them laid out on a stainless steel tray, you'd recognize most of them immediately, aside from the fact they were made of bronze and sometimes decorated, because Romans couldn't resist adding flair. There were curved scalpels for muscle cutting, spoon-shaped curettes for scraping wounds, and small hooks used to extract arrowheads or stitch tendons. They even had dilators for widening passages. Let's just leave that one politely vague. What's striking is that the designs worked. The handles were ergonomic. The blades were sharp. Many were stored in wooden or leather cases, portable surgical kits that field doctors carried to war zones. In the ruins of Pompeii, one entire physician's office was found intact, complete with shelves of instruments, jars of ointments, and a small bronze statue of Asclepius, god of healing. The setup wouldn't look out of place in a 19th century surgery, which is both impressive and slightly unsettling. Battlefield medicine, the empire's ambulance service. Rome's legions were not just soldiers, they were walking medical experiments. Wherever the army marched, doctors followed. The Medici military physicians had specialized tents and equipment ready to patch up the endless flow of men coming in with stab wounds, broken bones, and occasionally trampled pride. The Romans even organized valetudinaria, permanent field hospitals, with separate wards for different injuries and staff trained for surgical triage. It was an early glimpse of modern medical logistics. Amputations were performed with terrifying speed and efficiency, usually under the light of an oil lamp, with wine as anesthesia and a prayer as backup. Sometimes, they'd cauterize wounds with hot metal, which, yes, worked, but probably didn't make anyone nostalgic for the experience. Their understanding of infection was primitive, but their sanitation was impressive by ancient standards. Clean water flowed into camps, and waste was carried away through carefully dug channels. In fact, the army's hygiene practices were so good that civilian cities sometimes copied them. So, the next time someone romanticizes ancient warfare, remind them, somewhere behind the battle lines, a man with a bronze scalpel and absolutely no morphine was about to get very busy. The beauty of bloodletting. If there's one Roman medical practice that deserves its own category of confusion, it's bloodletting. You had a fever? Bloodletting. Bloodletting. Feeling melancholy because your favorite gladiator lost? Obviously, bloodletting. The logic was simple. Too much blood meant your internal balance was off. The solution? Remove some. Doctors used small knives or cups heated over fire to create suction. Patients would sometimes leave the clinic dizzy but purified. And, to be fair, for certain conditions, like high blood pressure, a little blood loss might have helped. Mostly, though, it was a placebo with extra steps. Still, people swore by it for centuries. Even emperors weren't spared. Augustus reportedly used bloodletting for joint pain, and Nero probably tried it because it sounded dramatic. Healing herbs and superstitions. The Roman pharmacopoeia was a strange and colorful affair. They used herbs, minerals, and animal parts, sometimes grounded in logic, sometimes pure whimsy. For stomach problems, there was mint. For sleep, poppy juice, which, yes, is opium. For headaches, willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the basis for aspirin. So occasionally they nailed it. But then came the less rational cures. Crushed mouse brains for toothache, goat's milk for tuberculosis, and powdered emeralds for eye infections, which probably did more for your jewelry bill than your vision. Some remedies blurred into religion. Doctors might prescribe amulets with carved prayers or instruct patients to whisper healing words while facing east at sunrise. It was science, but with a heavy mystical aftertaste. Women, midwives, and the art of birth. In a world dominated by men, women's healthcare was handled, naturally, by women. Midwives, or obstetrics, were respected professionals who learned through apprenticeship. They delivered babies, performed basic gynecological procedures, and often served as the only accessible healers for poor families. Their toolkits included birthing stools, swaddling cloths, and herbal concoctions to encourage labor, usually involving honey, wine, and a prayer to Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth. Some texts even mention cesarean sections, though these were typically done post-mortem, when the mother didn't survive. Roman society celebrated fertility publicly but treated female anatomy as something slightly mysterious and inconvenient. Galen himself believed the uterus wandered inside the body like a lost animal, causing hysteria. Science took a few centuries to correct that one. The sanitation paradox. Rome's public health system was both brilliant and terrible, often at the same time. They had running water, sewers, and bathhouses, genuine miracles of urban planning. But they also had open drains, shared sponges, and a fondness for communal baths where diseases mingled freely. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, was a triumph of engineering. It drained stormwater and waste straight into the Tiber River. Unfortunately, the Tiber was also a source of drinking water. So, while the plumbing was advanced, the concept of bacterial contamination was still a few empires away. Yet, despite it all, Roman cities had life expectancies higher than many medieval towns that came after. Their obsession with bathing, even if sometimes misguided, genuinely improved hygiene. It's one of history's odd ironies that an empire famous for decadence was, in practice, cleaner than most of Europe for the next 1,000 years. The emperor's personal ailments. Rome's leaders weren't immune to strange medical obsessions. Julius Caesar, for instance, suffered from seizures. His doctors debated endlessly about whether it was epilepsy or something else entirely, though it didn't stop him from conquering Gaul. Claudius had a limp and a stammer, both of which made the Senate underestimate him, which probably saved his life more than once. Tiberius obsessed over his digestion. He moved to Capri partly for the sea air, which was the ancient version of saying, "I'm going to detox." And then there was Caligula, who claimed to suffer from insomnia so severe that he wandered his palace at night, talking to the moon. It's unclear if any Roman doctor ever tried to treat him, or if they simply nodded, wrote, exhaustion, and slowly backed away. Veterinary medicine, because horses mattered more than you. Surprisingly, Roman medicine extended to animals. Military horses were valuable, so veterinarians, called mulomedici, existed specifically to keep them healthy. They used herbal poultices for wounds, ointments for infections, and even practiced early forms of inoculation. There are surviving manuals describing how to treat colic, mend tendons, and soothe anxious animals with wine, a solution that probably worked just as well for their owners. Farmers also learned to treat cattle, sheep, and even bees. The Geoponica, a Byzantine agricultural text descended from Roman sources, has entire chapters on apiculture, including advice like sing softly when opening the hive. Charming, ineffective, very Roman. Anatomy by guesswork. Since dissecting human bodies was taboo, Roman doctors relied on animals, mostly pigs and monkeys, to study anatomy. It worked surprisingly well, except for the parts that didn't. They believed blood flowed from the liver rather than circulating, and that the brain existed mainly to cool the blood. Still, for a civilization working without microscopes or permission slips, their anatomical models were remarkably detailed. Some temples even displayed wax models of healed body parts as offerings, early versions of medical case studies, if you like your science devotional. The quiet end of Roman medicine. When the empire declined, so did its medical system. Hospitals closed. Texts were lost. Herbal knowledge lingered, but the precision of Roman surgery faded into legend. Medieval Europe inherited fragments, Galen's theories without his methods, cleanliness without the plumbing. It would take over 1,000 years for medicine to rediscover what the Romans had already known: clean water, sharp tools, and the importance of washing your hands before surgery. Some lessons take time. And so, Rome's doctors, with their bronze scalpels and confident diagnoses, faded into history, replaced by monks, barbers, and occasionally a very determined village healer. But their instruments remain, buried in ash, polished, waiting, a silent reminder that once upon a time, medicine was practiced by candlelight, with equal parts science and superstition, and somehow, it worked just enough to keep an empire breathing. Chapter 3. The Roman machines that shouldn't have existed. The Romans, it seems, were never content to move water or carve stone by hand. Once they'd mastered aqueducts and concrete, they looked around at their empire and thought, surely we can make this easier with a machine. And so they did. Slowly, ingeniously, sometimes terrifyingly. Cranes that lifted mountains. Roman cranes were not toys. They were fully industrial. Imagine a construction site with 20-ton blocks of marble, hundreds of men sweating, and pulleys spinning overhead. That was normal for Rome. The cranes themselves were powered by tread wheels. A worker would step inside a giant wooden wheel, think of it as a human hamster wheel, and walk forward. That motion turned gears, ropes, and pulleys, lifting massive stones into place. At sites like Baalbek and the Colosseum, these cranes handled columns taller than a modern bus and weighing more than a small car. And all of this was coordinated manually. There were no motors, no hydraulics, just physics and the patience of 1,000 laborers. Sometimes, a worker would misstep, and the whole contraption might tilt, dropping marble blocks in a way that was extremely inconvenient for anyone in the vicinity. But mostly it worked. Mostly. The Romans even designed cranes with multiple pulleys, allowing a single wheel to lift heavier loads than anyone would have thought possible. It's sobering to consider that while medieval Europe later struggled to lift stones, Rome had cranes that modern engineers would nod at in approval. Odometers, because counting miles was hard. Romans were obsessed with precision. Their roads, after all, stretched across the known world. It wasn't enough to build them, they had to measure them. Enter the odometer. Yes, the Romans built odometers. Not digital, obviously. Mechanical. Ingenious. Friction gears attached to a wheel, counting each rotation. After a set distance, a small peg would fall into a box, making a faint sound to indicate a mile had passed. It was basically the first mile counter, and they carried them on carts. Military officials, surveyors, and ambitious engineers all used them to calculate distances for roads, armies, and tax collection. One wonders what it sounded like, perhaps a faint tick-tick-tick as a cart trundled along a dusty Roman road. A mechanical heartbeat marking the empire's endless expansion. The wonders of the theater. Rome loved spectacle, and where there's a crowd, there's a need for machinery. Take the mechanical stage. Many theaters in the empire had rotating stages, trapdoors, elevators, and pulleys for moving actors, animals, and scenery. Some stages could simulate ship battles, flooding the arena with water and tiny model ships while thousands of spectators watched, probably with popcorn. Well, something like popcorn, maybe roasted grain. They even had wind machines for storm effects and trapdoors to release animals into the arena. It's hard not to imagine a Roman stagehand muttering, "I hope the lions don't eat anyone tonight," while cranking a pulley and adjusting the water flow. The ingenuity was impressive, but also slightly absurd. Rome could raise mountains of marble with cranes, and yet their most celebrated achievement was making a stage collapse at exactly the right dramatic moment. The power of water mills. Romans loved water so much, they powered not just fountains but industry. By the 1st century CE, water mills dotted the empire. They ground grain, sawed wood, and even powered small textile machines. Some were single-wheel operations. Others, like the famous Barbagal mills in southern Gaul, had 16 wheels in cascade. A river would flow through them, turning wheel after wheel, grinding enough flour to feed thousands of people daily. It was an industrial revolution in miniature. And yet, oddly, very few cities fully embraced this level of mechanization. The technology existed, but adoption was uneven. Still, the ingenuity is undeniable. Water flowed not just to fountains but to power, to productivity. Rome's economy quietly hummed under the soft, constant movement of gears and wheels. Hero steam engines. Tiny, pointless, perfect. And of course, Hero of Alexandria comes back, because you can't talk about Roman machines without him. His Eolipile wasn't a practical engine. It was a sphere that spun on a pivot when heated. Steam escaped from nozzles, making it rotate. No one used it to power factories. No one attached it to chariots. But it demonstrated the principle centuries before anyone else thought of steam engines. Hero also described devices for automated temples, doors that opened when fire was lit, mechanical birds that sang, and theater machines that could mimic wind or rain. They were tiny, mostly pointless, yet undeniably delightful. It's hard not to smile imagining a Roman citizen seeing a mechanical dove fluttering in a temple courtyard and thinking, divine, obviously. Military engineering, more than catapults. Rome's engineers weren't limited to cities. Their legions had machines for war that doubled as impressive engineering feats. Ballistae, for example, were giant crossbows capable of hurling stones, bolts, or fire over long distances. They were accurate, powerful, and terrifying. Then there were siege towers, movable multi-story platforms on wheels. Soldiers could ascend, protected from arrows, and then punch through walls. Some were several stories tall, requiring coordination, pulleys, and the patience of a monastery full of accountants. Interestingly, engineers sometimes reused civilian tech for military purposes. Cranes became siege lifts, water wheels became mill-based battering mechanisms. Rome was resourceful in ways that were both brilliant and terrifying for the poor townsfolk under siege. The iron teeth of Roman industry. Rome also understood metallurgy. They weren't making microchips, obviously, but their ability to forge, mold, and manipulate iron, bronze, and lead was impressive. They built tools for construction, war, agriculture, and medicine. Precision mattered. Coin dies, surgical instruments, and weaponry all required tight tolerances. Some of their machines, like bellows for furnaces, were surprisingly sophisticated. They allowed blacksmiths to reach temperatures high enough to forge durable steel. It's sobering to realize that a Roman blacksmith could produce tools that would remain serviceable for centuries. Ongoing innovations, but limited spread. Despite all this ingenuity, Roman machines didn't spread as much as one might expect. Many innovations were localized or dependent on skilled labor. A water mill in Gaul might exist, but the knowledge didn't always travel to Britannia. Roman society valued conquest and spectacle more than widespread industrial application. Still, when the empire functioned at its peak, it ran on a combination of human muscle, water, gears, and ingenuity. That alone is remarkable. Machines and the human element. What stands out, perhaps most of all, is how intimately Roman machines depended on humans. The cranes needed walkers. The mills needed maintenance. The theaters needed stagehands. And the aqueducts needed constant care, lest Rome's elegant plumbing turn into a flood of sewage. Rome invented many things, but they were never automated in the modern sense. They were more like an orchestra. Every element, human, hydraulic, or mechanical, had to play in perfect harmony. And somehow, for centuries, it worked. The legacy of Roman machines. When Rome fell, many of these machines were forgotten. The complex water-lifting devices, the advanced mills, the automatic doors, most disappeared, leaving only descriptions in texts, fragments of ruins, and occasional awestruck notes from later travelers. Medieval engineers would rediscover some of these concepts, often centuries later, amazed that the ancients could manage such sophistication without engines, electricity, or even algebra as we know it. And yet, these machines were quietly efficient, unobtrusive marvels. They didn't scream their genius. They hummed along, letting aqueducts flow, mills grind, and theaters entertain. The Romans were practical, elegant, and occasionally whimsical. Their tech was both a tool and a statement, proof that human ingenuity could tame water, stone, and even a little bit of steam. Chapter 4. Roman roads, bridges, and the infrastructure that never quit. If Rome built its empire on water, machinery, and baths, it certainly didn't stumble far from that path when it came to roads and bridges. Their infrastructure was less about decoration and more about absolute, enduring practicality, with just enough flair to remind travelers that yes, they were very much in Rome's world now. Roads that would outlast empires. Rome's roads were marvels of engineering. Not just paths through dirt, but multi-layered constructions designed to last centuries. A typical road had a base of large stones, followed by smaller stones, gravel, and sand. On top sat tightly fitted paving slabs, often with a slight curvature for drainage. It was almost overkill, which seems very Roman. Every road was designed to carry armies, merchants, messengers, and occasionally emperors trying to impress foreign dignitaries. One of the most famous, the Via Appia, stretched over 350 miles from Rome to Brindisi. It took decades to build and required tunnels, bridges, and careful surveying. Imagine walking it, hearing the rhythmic clop of a horse's hooves, and realizing that these same stones still exist today. The Roman obsession with durability extended to maintenance. Milestones marked distances, teams repaired potholes, and engineers constantly monitored the slopes and drainage. They understood, intuitively, that a well-built road was more than convenience. It was power. Bridges that defied gravity. Bridges were another domain where Roman engineers quietly outshone almost everyone else in history. The Pons Fabricius, built in 62 BC, still spans the Tiber. It uses arches, which the Romans perfected. Arches distribute weight elegantly, allowing stone bridges to withstand floods, earthquakes, and centuries of foot traffic. Many bridges were built with multiple arches and piers, designed to let water flow freely underneath while supporting carts above. Some were temporary for military campaigns. Others were permanent monuments, intended to last millennia. Interestingly, some Roman bridges survived even better than their modern counterparts, which often succumbed to rust, erosion, or poor planning. It's slightly humbling, especially if you consider that many modern engineers have calculators, 3D software, and structural steel, while Romans had geometry, gravity, and sheer determination. Surveying the empire. Rome's infrastructure was only as good as its planning. Enter the agrimensors, or surveyors. Surveying was a serious profession. Agrimensors used groma, a simple but effective instrument, to align roads, fields, and boundaries. They also used measuring ropes, plumb bobs, and sighting poles. With these tools, they laid out cities, roads, and aqueducts with astonishing precision. Surveying wasn't just technical, it was political. Land had to be divided fairly for taxation, colonization, and military settlement. A poorly measured field could lead to protests, lawsuits, or even localized unrest. So Rome kept a watchful eye on the measurers, who were less glamorous than gladiators but perhaps equally feared when they showed up with ropes and stakes. Concrete on the move. Bridges and roads demanded concrete that could survive frost, floods, and occasionally someone losing a chariot wheel in the middle of it all. Roman concrete was versatile. For underwater structures, they mixed volcanic ash with lime, creating a material that could set underwater. Harbors, piers, and riverbanks benefited enormously. Without this, Rome's naval infrastructure would have been a soggy disaster. They also experimented with lightweight mixes for bridges and aqueducts, adding pumice to reduce weight. It's remarkable that they had an intuitive grasp of engineering principles like density, pressure, and stress, even without the formal physics we use today. Urban planning in the capital. Rome itself was a laboratory of infrastructure. Streets were straight, sewers ran underground, and public fountains distributed water efficiently. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first sewer systems, drained the city and connected to the Tiber. It wasn't perfect. The river also served as a source of drinking water, but compared to most contemporary cities, it was a marvel. Rome's street grid, while not uniform, allowed for efficient movement of people, goods, and armies. It wasn't just practical, it was an assertion of control. A city with straight, wide streets is easier to patrol, easier to tax, and harder to riot in unnoticed. Infrastructure as a political statement. Roman roads, bridges, and aqueducts weren't merely functional. They were propaganda in stone. Every milestone, triumphal arch, or imposing bridge reminded the populace who built them and who funded them. Senators and emperors used infrastructure to advertise competence and generosity. Look at this bridge, a stone might say. It exists because of me. Remember me when you cross it. Pay your taxes quietly. Even rural areas benefited. Roads connected distant towns to Rome, encouraging trade, mobility, and cultural assimilation. It was both carrot and stick, convenience paired with subtle domination. Ports and harbors, engineering the coastline. Rome's empire spanned seas as well as land, so ports were crucial. They built harbors with enormous concrete piers, designed to withstand tides, waves, and storms. Some harbors incorporated breakwaters, using concrete that could set underwater, long before anyone in Europe would think of such a thing again. The famous portus near Ostia was a massive undertaking. Canals, warehouses, and docks all carefully engineered to handle ships and cargo efficiently. Harbor design was sophisticated. Slipways allowed ships to be repaired without heavy cranes, quays facilitated loading, and lighthouses marked entrances. It's remarkable that Rome maintained this network over thousands of miles of coastline without electricity, engines, or GPS. Roads beyond the empire. Roman engineering didn't stop at borders. Roads radiated outward, influencing conquered territories. Merchants, armies, and travelers could move with remarkable speed. Roads in Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia were often paved in Roman style, some surviving as modern highways. The Romans also standardized measurements, ensuring that roads, mile markers, and construction methods remained consistent across the empire. It created a uniformity that reinforced Rome's presence even in far-flung provinces, subtly reminding locals that yes, Rome cared enough to pave your muddy path. Bridges, arches, and the art of durability. It's tempting to think of bridges as mundane, but Roman bridges were feats of both engineering and elegance. Arches distributed weight naturally. Some bridges had decorative elements, showing off imperial power without compromising function. Durability mattered more than decoration, but they managed both. Many bridges still carry traffic today, not pedestrian replicas, but actual vehicles. There's a certain poetry in crossing a Roman bridge built 2,000 years ago, with stones laid by hands long gone, yet still holding firm. Maintenance, the unsung hero. Of course, even the best roads and bridges require upkeep. Rome had teams for road maintenance, cleaning drainage channels, and repairing damage. Milestones sometimes indicated who was responsible for repairs, essentially early civil service accountability. Without this, many roads might have fallen into disrepair quickly, and the empire's connectivity would have suffered. It's another reminder that infrastructure isn't just invention, it's devotion. The quiet genius of Roman civility. Ultimately, Roman infrastructure was less about flash and more about permanence. Their roads carried soldiers and merchants. Their bridges survived floods and centuries. Their ports facilitated trade and administration. It's impressive not just because the materials were strong, but because the Romans understood systems. They planned, they measured, they built for scale. They weren't content with a short-term fix. They built for eternity, or at least until something else came along to disturb the peace. And in that quiet dedication, there's a sort of modernity. Rome, in many ways, anticipated civil engineering centuries before it became a formal discipline. Infrastructure as empire. Every mile of road, every stone bridge, every aqueduct whispered the same thing: Rome exists. It was power expressed through bricks and concrete, water and arches, roads and milestones. Travelers moving through the empire couldn't ignore it. Whether carrying grain, soldiers, or letters, they felt Rome's hand guiding their journey. Infrastructure, in Rome, wasn't invisible. It was a presence, reliable, impressive, and quietly imposing. From empire to legacy. When Rome fell, much of this infrastructure survived. Some roads fell into ruin, some bridges were abandoned, but many continued to serve medieval Europe. Roman engineering became the skeleton upon which later civilizations built. It's easy to underestimate their genius. Roads that lasted centuries, bridges that defied floods, aqueducts delivering water over impossible distances. These were the quiet achievements that made an empire possible. Rome was, in many ways, an empire of systems. Water, roads, bridges, ports, and buildings all worked together, creating cohesion and connectivity across vast lands. And tonight, as the empire has long since gone, you can still see traces of it in Europe's landscapes. Walk a Roman road. Cross a Roman bridge. Let yourself notice the meticulous stonework, the precision, the stubborn durability. And in that quiet observation, you might feel, just a little, the pulse of an empire that once ran on stone, water, and human determination. Chapter 5. Roman siege engines, water wheels, and the subtle art of industrial domination. Rome, of course, didn't just build for beauty or convenience. Their machines were practical and sometimes terrifyingly efficient. They built siege engines that could batter walls, water wheels that ground mountains of grain, and mechanical devices that quietly hinted at an empire capable of moving both men and matter on an industrial scale. Ballistae and catapults, the art of throwing heavy things. Roman armies loved precision, and nowhere was it more evident than in their artillery. Ballistae were essentially giant crossbows, capable of hurling bolts or stones over long distances. They were accurate enough to hit formations of troops, destroy gates, or occasionally terrify livestock. Then there were catapults, torsion-powered machines that flung heavier projectiles with terrifying force. Some historians claim they could launch stones weighing over 100 pounds. It's tempting to imagine Roman engineers calculating trajectories with scrolls and abacuses, muttering to each other, "Yes, 45 degrees will do nicely, let's ruin that wall by noon." Siege engines weren't just destructive, they were psychological. The mere sight of a massive stone-hurling machine on the horizon could convince defenders that surrender was preferable to whatever was coming next. Towers on wheels. Roman engineers also loved vertical solutions. Siege towers were enormous, multi-story wooden constructions on wheels. They allowed soldiers to ascend above fortifications, protected from arrows and rocks. These towers had ramps, platforms, and sometimes even primitive drawbridges. Moving them was a slow, careful process, often requiring dozens of men pushing, pulling, and sweating while engineers adjusted pulleys and braces. Once in position, the tower functioned as a mobile command post, elevated, intimidating, and occasionally a source of embarrassment if it tipped over. Which, by some accounts, did happen occasionally, though engineers were quick to rebuild and try again. Water wheels, Rome's silent laborers. While catapults made headlines on battlefields, water wheels quietly powered the empire. Water mills ground grain, sawed timber, and even powered rudimentary textile machines. The Barbigal Mill complex in southern Gaul had 16 wheels in cascade, producing enough flour to feed tens of thousands of people every day. Water wheels were elegant, efficient, and disturbingly silent. They converted flowing water into rotational energy with minimal friction, centuries before engineers would truly understand the physics behind it. Some were vertical, some horizontal. Some used overshot designs, letting water pour over the wheel from above, maximizing efficiency. The Romans even combined wheels with gears and pulleys for secondary tasks, like lifting sacks of grain or driving simple cranes. These mills were industrial precursors, quietly proving that the Romans understood the principles of mechanized labor long before the Industrial Revolution. The genius of Roman mechanical integration. What's striking is how Romans integrated machines into daily life. Water flowed through aqueducts to baths, fountains, and mills. Crane systems lifted stones into temples. Siege engines were reused in civilian construction when needed or adapted for industrial purposes. Machines weren't isolated curiosities. They were part of a larger ecosystem, hydraulics, mechanics, and human labor working in tandem. A Roman engineer would survey a site, measure slopes, calculate loads, and deploy machines efficiently. The result was a quiet industrial sophistication, subtle, effective, and sometimes terrifying. Subtlety and innovation. The Romans were not flashy inventors in the modern sense. Their genius was in practicality and subtle adaptation. Steam engines, like Hero's Eolipile, existed more as demonstrations than workhorses. Siege engines combined physics and brute force with elegant engineering. Watermills used flowing rivers to quietly accomplish tasks that would otherwise require hundreds of laborers. The point was never to dazzle, it was to do. Efficiency, longevity, and adaptability were the hallmarks of Roman engineering. Roads, bridges, and machines in concert. Rome's civil and industrial infrastructure worked together in remarkable ways. Roads carried grain from rural mills to urban markets. Bridges allowed armies and merchants to move seamlessly across rivers. Water-powered mills ensured cities were fed, while cranes lifted construction materials for temples, theaters, and aqueducts. It was a networked empire in the most literal sense. Every element connected to another, forming a rhythm of human and mechanical activity that hummed quietly across the Mediterranean. The human factor. Of course, all this ingenuity relied on people. Soldiers pushed siege towers. Millers tended water wheels. Laborers ran cranes. Surveyors measured distances with gromas, and engineers checked calculations with rudimentary tools. Without human labor, Roman machines were inert. They depended on skill, discipline, and sometimes brute force. Yet, remarkably, this integration of human effort with mechanical ingenuity allowed Rome to build an empire unparalleled in scale and complexity. Minor marvels of daily life. Not all Roman machines were designed for conquest or industry. Some were domestic or even whimsical. Hero's automata created moving statues and singing birds. Water-powered fountains delighted visitors in gardens and villas. Rotating dining rooms in imperial palaces slowly spun diners under the stars, powered by pulleys and clever design. It's a reminder that Roman engineering wasn't just about survival or efficiency. It could also entertain, impress, and occasionally humiliate. Engineering an empire. Rome's mechanical sophistication was inseparable from its political and social systems. Machines enabled armies to move and conquer. Infrastructure facilitated trade, taxation, and administration. Even luxurious automata in temples reinforced social hierarchies, impressing citizens and visitors with the empire's power and ingenuity. Engineering wasn't neutral, it was a tool of governance, persuasion, and control. The empire was a machine in itself, human, mechanical, and political. The quiet decline. As the empire weakened, so did its mechanical networks. Siege engines fell out of use, watermills were abandoned, and theaters stopped rotating. Roads cracked, bridges collapsed, and aqueducts dried. Some technology survived in fragments, descriptions, diagrams, or ruined machines buried under ash and soil. Much was forgotten, lost, or misinterpreted in the centuries that followed. It's easy to imagine a Roman water wheel grinding silently, abandoned, while vines slowly crept over its gears. A subtle reminder that even the cleverest systems can be fragile without constant maintenance. Legacy of Roman machines. Despite this decline, Roman ingenuity left a lasting mark. Medieval engineers rediscovered some principles. Renaissance scholars marveled at ancient mechanical texts. Modern historians and archaeologists can still reconstruct working models of watermills, cranes, and siege engines. Rome's machines, in their quiet, methodical way, proved that practical genius doesn't need fanfare to endure. They were designed to solve problems, lift heavy stones, grind grain, move water, and organize armies. They were reliable, repeatable, and surprisingly elegant. And though the empire eventually crumbled, the principles survived, waiting for humans to rediscover, reinterpret, and occasionally marvel. Machines as a reflection of Roman thought. Rome's machines mirrored its worldview. Practical, persistent, and connected. Every pulley, wheel, and aqueduct reflected a civilization focused on order, efficiency, and permanence. At the same time, they allowed for whimsy and spectacle, rotating stages, singing automata, wine-spouting fountains. The Romans weren't afraid to combine functionality with artistry, demonstrating that engineering could be both useful and playful. Closing thoughts. The machinery of Rome was everywhere, yet often invisible. It powered armies and economies, supported cities, and entertained elites. It reflected human labor and ingenuity, intertwined in a system as vast and intricate as the empire itself. And though centuries have passed, the echoes remain, in surviving aqueducts, bridges, roads, and ruins of mills. The Romans taught the quiet lesson that technology need not roar to be profound. It can hum along, steady and reliable, shaping the world silently, persistently, and sometimes beautifully. Chapter 6. Roman baths, heating, and the art of domestic engineering. If Roman machines were industrial, then Roman baths were domestic marvels. They weren't just places to get clean, though that was certainly a benefit. They were complex centers of plumbing, heating, and social interaction, all powered by ingenious engineering. Walking into a bathhouse, one could encounter hot and cold pools, steam rooms, saunas, massage areas, and sometimes even libraries and gardens. And none of this happened by accident. Aqueducts deliver more than water. We've touched on aqueducts before, but their domestic applications were just as impressive. Water from distant mountains flowed through channels and pipes into cities, supplying not just public fountains but also baths, private villas, and gardens. Lead pipes, fistulae, carried water precisely where it was needed. Some homes had their own systems, complete with taps and cisterns, offering a level of comfort that would be rare in Europe for another millennium. The Romans also understood the importance of pressure. Pipes were sized to maintain flow rates, and cisterns acted as regulators. Occasionally, lead poisoning might occur, but mostly it worked. And it looked elegant. The hypocaust, underfloor heating that actually worked. Bathhouses were hot. Not just metaphorically. The hypocaust system heated floors and walls using a network of channels carrying hot air from a furnace. Slaves or laborers stoked fires, sending warmth into spaces above and around the floor tiles. It was an early central heating system, impressively effective. A bathhouse could have rooms at different temperatures, hot, warm, and tepid, tailored for different bathing experiences. The system required careful planning. Floors had to be raised on pillars, pili, and walls had to allow circulation of heat. It was labor-intensive, but the Romans clearly decided that a chilled foot while relaxing in a bath was unacceptable. Private villas sometimes replicated the same technology, demonstrating that Roman elite domestic engineering could rival public works in sophistication. Baths as social machines. Roman baths were more than plumbing and heat. They functioned like social engines. Patrons could exercise, relax, discuss politics, network, and occasionally gossip about neighbors or emperors. The water, tiles, and heat were secondary to human interaction, though meticulously engineered to support it. Some bath complexes were enormous. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate thousands. They included hot and cold pools, libraries, gyms, gardens, and even snack vendors. It's easy to imagine the faint hum of conversation mixed with the occasional splash, a mechanical and social ecosystem running in parallel. Pipes, valves, and control. Roman engineers also understood the necessity of control. They installed lead or bronze valves to regulate water flow. Some baths had separate cisterns to supply different temperatures. Overflow channels prevented flooding, while sluices allowed maintenance without shutting down the entire system. It was plumbing on a scale that would rival many modern public facilities. And yet, it relied entirely on gravity, clever gradients, and human labor. No electricity, pumps, or computers. Baths for health, or at least appearances. Romans believed bathing had health benefits. Saunas and hot pools were said to improve circulation, while cold plunges invigorated the body. Steam rooms could clear sinuses, and massage rooms ease tension. Some remedies were more questionable: mud packs, scented oils, and exotic perfumes. But even if the science was uneven, the principle of regular bathing clearly promoted hygiene. It's tempting to think that this contributed to Rome's comparative longevity in urban centers, at least relative to post-Roman Europe. Kitchens, villas, and domestic automation. Baths were just one aspect of Roman domestic engineering. Villas were often equipped with central water systems, drainage, and rudimentary waste disposal. Kitchens had bronze utensils, stone grinders, and sometimes water-driven mills for flour or olive oil. Some elite houses incorporated mechanical doors or automatic fountains, often powered by gravity or simple pulleys. It wasn't widespread, but it indicates that Romans enjoyed novelty and convenience as long as it was compatible with their hydraulic systems. Gardens and hydraulic ornamentation. Wealthy Romans loved gardens, not just for plants, but for running water. Fountains, pools, and channels were designed to impress, refresh, and provide gentle white noise. Mechanical automata sometimes created bird songs or water spouts, delighting guests with subtle marvels of motion. It was engineering that was invisible at first glance. Water flowed, doors opened, fountains gushed, all silently demonstrating the household's sophistication and the engineer's skill. Waste management and hygiene. Romans also understood that water needed to go somewhere. Baths and villas included drains, sewers, and cesspits. Waste was channeled into larger urban sewers or pits, keeping living areas clean. It wasn't perfect, but it was far ahead of many later societies, which often conflated convenience with disease. Even private homes had simple traps to prevent smells, and some public bathhouses had attendants responsible for maintenance. It's a reminder that Roman technology was rarely isolated. It was a system, with every part dependent on others. Luxury meets function. Roman engineering often balanced utility and luxury. Baths needed heat, plumbing, and circulation, but they also had mosaics, marble floors, and decorative fountains. Water had to flow in precise ways, but it also had to look graceful. The Romans understood that technology wasn't just functional. It was an experience, an aesthetic, and occasionally a political statement. When an emperor visited, he didn't just look at the bath. He evaluated the plumbing, the temperature, the smoothness of the mosaics. And, of course, the engineers loved the attention, or at least the job security. Heating beyond baths. Hypocausts weren't limited to bathhouses. Wealthy homes often had heated rooms, sometimes entire floors. Floors were raised on pillars to allow hot air circulation. It was labor-intensive to maintain, requiring constant stoking of furnaces, but the result was comfort unmatched anywhere else at the time. Public buildings, temples, and even some offices incorporated similar principles, showing that Romans valued human comfort, not just survival. Plumbing as political infrastructure. Public baths and fountains also functioned as civic statements. A well-fed, well-watered populace is a quiet populace. Fountains reminded citizens of the emperor's generosity. Bathhouses reinforced social hierarchies, certain areas for elites, others for common citizens, but all dependent on the same hydraulic genius. Rome's plumbing was not just domestic, it was political, social, and economic infrastructure all at once. Subtle technological innovations. Romans were subtle inventors. Lead pipes, bronze valves, gravity-fed systems, and hypocausts represented iterative improvements rather than flashy breakthroughs. Machines weren't separate curiosities, they were woven into daily life, quietly improving living conditions and demonstrating control. Even mechanical automata in gardens or baths were functional in a sense. They entertained, regulated water flow, and showcased engineering skill. They were playful, efficient, and slightly absurd, perfectly Roman. Maintenance and longevity. The beauty of Roman baths and plumbing was not just in design, but in upkeep. Pipes, furnaces, and drains required regular attention. Slaves, laborers, and engineers monitored water flow, cleaned channels, and repaired leaks. Without human effort, the most sophisticated plumbing would fail. Yet with consistent maintenance, baths and aqueducts could operate for centuries, long after the empire's political structures had crumbled. It's a quiet testimony to Roman dedication to practicality, hygiene, and human comfort. Legacy of domestic engineering. Roman baths, plumbing, and hypocausts influenced later civilizations. Medieval Europe rediscovered heating systems and aqueduct principles. Renaissance engineers marveled at plumbing and hydraulic ingenuity. Even today, archaeologists reconstruct hypocausts and villas to understand how water, heat, and human labor combined to create comfort in antiquity. The lesson is simple: Rome didn't just conquer land. It engineered life. From private villas to imperial baths, the Romans proved that domestic technology could be sophisticated, elegant, and enduring. Closing thoughts. The Romans were practical, inventive, and subtle. Their baths weren't just luxury, they were infrastructure. Their hypocausts weren't just warm floors, they were early central heating systems. Their plumbing wasn't just water delivery, it was social, political, and civic engineering. In many ways, Roman domestic technology was as impressive as their roads, aqueducts, and siege engines. It silently shaped daily life, regulated society, and left traces of ingenuity that we can still see, touch, and study today. Even after centuries of decline, ruins of baths, hypocausts, and villas continue to whisper lessons about engineering, patience, and the quiet power of practical technology. Rome didn't just build an empire. It built systems, water, heat, and social order that flowed through cities, houses, and lives with subtle genius. And for anyone imagining themselves in a Roman bath, with the warmth beneath their feet, water flowing perfectly from a cistern above, and marble under their hands, it's easy to understand why these engineers were quietly the backbone of an empire. Chapter 7: Roman Communication, Postal Systems, and the Art of Moving Information. Rome was vast. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas divided its territories. An empire is only as powerful as its ability to move not just armies and goods, but information. And the Romans, unsurprisingly, built an impressive system for moving messages, a postal system that functioned like a silent network humming beneath the empire's roads. The cursus publicus, imperial messaging. The cursus publicus was Rome's official courier system. Established under Augustus, it enabled rapid transmission of letters, documents, and occasionally sensitive information across thousands of miles. Stations, called mutations and mansions, were positioned at intervals along major roads. Mutations allowed travelers to swap horses, keeping messages moving at speed. Mansions provided rest, food, and lodging for couriers and officials. Imagine a message traveling from Rome to the edges of Britannia. A courier would swap mounts at every station, cover 50 miles in a day, and deliver news that might otherwise have taken weeks. It's surprisingly efficient, considering there were no automobiles, railways, or GPS. Just horses, roads, and meticulous planning. Riders, horses, and human endurance. Riders were carefully trained. Their duty was speed, accuracy, and survival. Horses were rotated frequently to prevent fatigue, ensuring messages traveled almost as fast as the human and animal body allowed. The Romans even had rules about who could use the cursus publicus. Unauthorized individuals risked fines or imprisonment, a subtle reminder that information is valuable and Rome intended to control it. Couriers carried leather pouches, wax tablets, or papyrus scrolls, depending on the message's nature. Important dispatches were often sealed with imperial stamps, both to protect content and signify authority. Milestones, maps, and wayfinding. Rome's roads were measured carefully, every mile marked with milestones. Couriers could estimate distances and travel times with impressive accuracy. Maps were less common, but engineers and surveyors prepared itineraries, noting terrain, rivers, and key stations. It wasn't a GPS app, but it worked. Messages arrived reliably. The network was designed for redundancy. If one route was blocked, alternative roads could be used, sometimes guided by locals familiar with the landscape. Efficiency, economy, and control. The cursus publicus wasn't just about speed. It was a system of control and efficiency. Officials could monitor the flow of information. Merchants and civilians had limited access. Taxes could be enforced more effectively when decrees traveled quickly. Military orders reached outposts without undue delay. Rome understood that information is power and designed infrastructure accordingly. It was subtle but remarkably sophisticated. Communication itself became an instrument of imperial dominance. Letters, scrolls, and the medium of messages. Most Roman messages traveled on papyrus scrolls. Wax tablets, reusable and lightweight, were used for less formal or temporary communications. Important state messages were often sealed with signet rings, leaving imprints to indicate authenticity. Forgery was discouraged, and, in some cases, punished severely. Messages were concise, formal, and practical. No one had time for long-winded storytelling. Even private letters were mostly transactional, arrangements, requests, or family updates. Though occasionally, some humor or sentiment slipped in, a reminder that behind the empire were humans with slightly absurd lives. Signal systems, visual and auditory alerts. Long-distance messaging sometimes relied on visual cues. Beacons, fire signals, or smoke could convey warnings across vast distances. It was primitive but effective. During wars or rebellions, a distant fort could alert others of incoming threats in hours rather than days. The system relied heavily on human interpretation, timing, and line of sight. Misreading a signal could cause unnecessary panic, though Roman soldiers were trained to interpret signals carefully. Auditory signals, horns, drums, or bells supplemented the network locally. It was a multi-layered communication system, integrating road-based couriers, visual beacons, and sound, all synchronized to keep the empire informed. Local messaging and urban networks. Inside cities, messaging was also surprisingly efficient. Slaves, attendants, or professional messengers carried letters and packages across urban centers. In Rome itself, a city of over 1 million inhabitants at its peak, messages had to navigate dense streets, markets, and public spaces. Some large households maintained private runners, while public offices employed messengers to distribute official decrees. It was a small, organized chaos, managed with the discipline typical of Roman bureaucracy. Security, surveillance, and reliability. Information moved fast, but Rome understood that speed without security was useless. Seals, messengers sworn to secrecy, and official routes ensured reliability. In times of crisis, couriers were accompanied by guards. The system also created accountability. Letters could be traced to their origin or delivery point, reducing forgery and miscommunication. Reliability mattered more than drama. The Romans weren't interested in flair, they wanted certainty. Even when roads were muddy or rivers flooded, the network adapted, demonstrating resilience and flexibility. Communication as empire. The Cursus Publicus illustrates a broader principle. Rome's empire was not just about roads, armies, or aqueducts. It was about information flow. Orders, news, and policy moved almost as efficiently as troops. Governors, generals, and magistrates relied on this network to coordinate actions across thousands of miles. It wasn't perfect. Delays, weather, and human error occurred, but it was revolutionary for the time. Few civilizations matched Rome in organized, empire-wide communication. Integration with other technologies. The postal system worked in harmony with other Roman technologies. Roads allowed fast travel. Bridges prevented delays. Water management supported urban centers that relied on timely delivery of goods and messages. Even siege engines and military planning benefited indirectly. Messages reached commanders quickly, who could then deploy machines and troops efficiently. Rome's technology was interconnected, not isolated feats of engineering, but a comprehensive, functioning system. Private correspondence and social networks. While the state controlled official messages, private correspondence thrived. Families sent letters to estates, merchants coordinated trade, and friends exchanged news. Wax tablets could be erased and reused, while scrolls stored in homes documented contracts, debts, and events. Even private letters show hints of social humor and snark, reminding us that Roman humans were as complex as the empire itself. In some ways, domestic communication mirrored civil infrastructure, organized, hierarchical, and surprisingly reliable. The Cursus Publicus and economy. The network also supported commerce. Merchants could transmit orders and coordinate shipments. Inns and stations provided lodging for travelers moving goods. Goods, services, and information moved hand in hand, fueling economic stability and growth. In a sense, Rome's postal system was a backbone of both government and economy. It ensured that decisions could be implemented, taxes collected, and trade coordinated. Human labor and coordination. It's easy to imagine this network as mechanical, but humans were essential. Couriers needed stamina, local attendants managed stations, and officials maintained oversight. Even small errors could cascade. A delayed horse, a misread seal, or a muddy road could slow the flow. Yet the system endured, demonstrating both human discipline and careful planning. It was a quiet, persistent hum of labor, horses, and scrolls moving across the empire. Legacy of Roman communication. The Cursus Publicus set a precedent for later postal systems in Europe. Medieval messengers, stagecoaches, and early modern postal networks drew inspiration from Roman organization. Even the idea of relay stations, horse changes, and standardized routes echoes the infrastructure Rome built. It's striking that thousands of years later, some principles remain the same. Fast, reliable, and secure message delivery depends on planning, labor, and redundancy. Closing thoughts. Rome's empire was vast, complex, and impressive, but communication was the silent glue that held it together. Roads, bridges, and water systems supported armies and cities. Siege engines and industrial machines enabled conquest and production. But without messages moving across this network, orders would stall, armies would drift, and governance would fail. The Cursus Publicus demonstrates that engineering isn't only about concrete, gears, or water. It's also about movement of humans, horses, and information. And in that subtle, quiet efficiency lies Rome's genius. An empire not just of territory, but of systems, mechanical, hydraulic, and communicative, all working together in harmony. Chapter 8. Roman entertainment, engineering spectacle, and theaters that moved. Rome loved spectacle. Not just gladiators, chariot races, or lavish feasts, though those certainly counted, but mechanical and hydraulic marvels that made public entertainment a carefully engineered experience. Theaters, amphitheaters, and arenas weren't just spaces to sit. They were machines in themselves. The Romans built stages that moved, trapdoors that revealed actors, and water channels that allowed full-scale naval reenactments. The mechanical stage. Roman theaters often included rotating platforms, elevators, and pulleys for scenery and actors. Trapdoors allowed actors or props to appear dramatically. Some stages even had multiple levels, so a single scene could transition smoothly without interrupting the flow. Consider the engineering required, supporting weight, balancing platforms, and operating these devices reliably. All manually controlled, of course, often by a team of stagehands hidden below the stage. It wasn't just function, it was precision. Actors had to hit their marks, props had to move without incident, and audiences had to remain impressed rather than terrified by collapsing machinery. Naumachii, the water battles. Some amphitheaters staged naumachii, full-scale naval reenactments. They flooded arenas, sometimes partially or completely, and brought in ships for mock battles. Water channels, sluices, and pumps allowed control over water depth, flow, and drainage. The effort required was enormous. Engineers coordinated hydraulics, ensured safety, and timed battles to impress spectators. Imagine a Roman audience watching ships glide across a flooded arena, unaware of the meticulous planning keeping them afloat. It was a combination of engineering, spectacle, and subtle intimidation. Look how much power we can manipulate, even in entertainment. Elevators, trapdoors, and automation. Some theaters had mechanical elevators to lift scenery, animals, or actors. Pulley systems, counterweights, and hidden shafts allowed vertical movement on demand. Stagehands operated these quietly, creating the illusion of magic. Ramada, like statues that moved or birds that sang, sometimes adorned stages or gardens. They were powered by water, weights, or simple mechanics, playful, elegant, and slightly absurd. Hero of Alexandria described similar devices, emphasizing motion, sound, and surprise. Roman engineers clearly understood that mechanical spectacle was as much about delight as utility. Amphitheaters as industrial machines. The Colosseum wasn't just for show. Beneath the arena floor, a network of elevators, pulleys, and trapdoors allowed cages, animals, and scenery to rise into view. It was industrial theater, each cage, elevator, and hoist timed perfectly to deliver the intended dramatic effect. There were lifts for elephants, bears, and leopards. Platforms could move simultaneously, revealing multiple surprises. It's hard not to admire the engineering, even if one regrets the intended victims of some spectacles. Water, pumps, and hydraulic genius. Romans didn't rely on magic, they relied on water. Sluices, channels, and tanks delivered controlled flows for fountains, naumachii, and baths. Cisterns supplied water under gravity, while pumps redistributed it when necessary. Engineers had to calculate volume, flow rates, and pressure, all without modern hydrodynamics. Yet somehow the system worked. Water performed on cue, creating dramatic effect without flooding the spectators or destroying structures. Seating, acoustics, and crowd management. Engineering extended to the audience. Seats were tiered for visibility. Vomitoria, the cleverly named exit passages, allowed tens of thousands to enter or leave efficiently. Acoustics were considered. Theaters were designed so speeches and music carried to distant rows without amplification. It was engineering aimed at subtle control, comfort, and immersion. Every component, from stair width to angle of walls, affected the audience's experience. Integration with urban infrastructure. Theaters and amphitheaters were linked to aqueducts, roads, and public squares. Fountains cooled crowds, sewage channels drained excess water, and nearby roads allowed easy access for merchants, officials, and performers. It was a networked approach. Entertainment was integrated with public infrastructure, not isolated from it. The Romans were pragmatic. Even spectacle required planning, engineering, and logistics. Safety and redundancy. Even in entertainment, the Romans considered failure. Trapdoors and elevators had backup ropes and counterweights. Animals were restrained carefully. Platforms were reinforced. Failures were rare, but contingency planning existed, a subtle sign of the meticulous nature of Roman engineering. It's an interesting contrast. spectacular, dramatic, and thrilling, yet underpinned by careful calculation and redundancy. Mechanical innovation for play and prestige. Some mechanical innovations were playful rather than strictly functional. Automata birds, rotating statues, or water-powered singing devices were both engineering feats and symbols of status. Elite Romans sometimes competed to create the most impressive display, small-scale engineering contests in private villas or gardens. The point was not survival or conquest but delight and subtle intimidation. I can manipulate water, motion, and metal. Aren't you impressed? The social aspect of spectacle. Theaters and arenas also reinforced social hierarchies. Seating was arranged by class, status, and office. The spectacle itself demonstrated power. Emperors, sponsors, and engineers collaborated to awe citizens. Engineering was invisible yet omnipresent, structuring not just movement, but social order. In that sense, Roman entertainment was as much about politics as pleasure, and engineering quietly reinforced both. Lessons from Roman stagecraft. Roman theaters, amphitheaters, and entertainment machinery show that engineering can serve multiple purposes. Function, supporting actors, animals, and scenery. Spectacle, creating awe, surprise, and delight. Integration, coordinating with water, roads, and urban infrastructure. Control, guiding audiences, reinforcing social hierarchies. All of these were achieved without electricity, motors, or digital systems. Instead, they relied on gravity, pulleys, levers, water, and human labor. Legacy of Roman entertainment engineering. Medieval and Renaissance engineers rediscovered many of these principles. The concept of trapdoors, stage lifts, and hydraulic machines influenced theater design for centuries. Even today, automated stages, water effects, and mechanical set changes echo Roman ingenuity. The Romans may not have had electricity, but they invented systems that manipulated space, time, and perception with precision. Closing thoughts. Roman entertainment was more than amusement. It was industrialized spectacle. It was hydraulic ingenuity. It was social control and subtle awe, all orchestrated with invisible engineering. The audience might see only actors, animals, or water, unaware of the pulleys, sluices, elevators, and human labor operating seamlessly below and around them. It's easy to imagine engineers, hidden under the stage or behind the scenes, watching, adjusting, and smiling at their quiet mastery. The performance was ephemeral, but the engineering was permanent, a subtle, invisible triumph of Roman intellect and precision. And for anyone sitting in a tiered seat, watching water gush, platforms rise, and scenery move, it's almost impossible not to admire the empire that could blend spectacle, social order, and engineering so seamlessly. Chapter 9. Roman mining, metallurgy, and the subterranean machines that powered an empire. Rome's ingenuity wasn't limited to roads, aqueducts, or baths. It extended underground into mines and workshops, where machinery and human effort extracted the materials that built an empire. Metal, stone, and other resources were the quiet backbone of Roman power. Without them, aqueducts, siege engines, coins, and even baths would be impossible. Mining on a grand scale. Romans mined extensively for gold, silver, lead, iron, and copper. Some mines, like those at Rio Tinto in Hispania, were enormous, layered, flooded, and complex. Miners worked with hammers, picks, and chisels. Water channels were used to flush debris or remove ore. It was labor-intensive, dangerous work, but Rome valued output over comfort. Interestingly, Romans were aware of ventilation and structural stability. Mine shafts were planned to reduce collapse risk, and air shafts sometimes allowed fresh air to circulate. It wasn't modern engineering, but it worked remarkably well. Hydraulic mining, water as a tool. Romans didn't just dig, they also engineered. Hydraulic mining was common, especially for gold. Water was channeled to mine faces, eroding sediment and washing away lighter material, leaving heavier metals behind. Reservoirs, channels, and sluices made this possible. The system required careful planning. Too much water, and the mine could flood. Too little, and extraction was inefficient. Romans balanced power and precision, turning water into a silent labor underground. Or processing and metallurgy. Once extracted, metals were smelted in furnaces. Lead and tin were melted for plumbing and coins. Iron and bronze were forged into tools, weapons, and construction materials. Furnaces were carefully engineered for airflow, heat control, and efficiency. Bellows, clay chimneys, and multiple fireboxes allowed precise temperature regulation, critical for metals like bronze. Workshops were noisy, smoky, and hot. Slaves and laborers tended furnaces, bellows, and molds, sometimes for decades of repetitive work. Yet the output fueled an empire. Weapons, armor, tools, coins, and decorative items flowed from these industrial sites. Mills and mechanical assistance underground. In some cases, water power assisted mining operations. Water wheels powered dewatering devices, lifting water from lower shafts. Mechanical trip hammers crushed or for smelting. Even underground, Rome integrated machinery and human effort to maximize efficiency. It's easy to imagine a subterranean hum, water flowing through channels, hammers striking and laborers moving rhythmically through shafts. A silent orchestra of extraction and production, unseen by the outside world, but essential to the empire above. Standardization and efficiency. Romans standardized coins, tools, and metal alloys, demonstrating early quality control. Lead pipes were uniform in size. Bronze statues followed consistent proportions. Coins were minted to specific weights. This ensured reliability in construction, trade, and taxation. Even metallurgy served administrative purposes. Coins weren't just currency, but propaganda, stamped with images of emperors or gods. Metalwork communicated authority as effectively as roads or aqueducts. Mining communities. Mining wasn't just mechanical, it was social. Workers lived near mines, often in company-style settlements. Food, water, and shelter were provided, but working conditions were harsh. Disease, accidents, and cave-ins were constant risks. Romans were pragmatic. Productivity and control mattered more than comfort. Yet in some regions, mining settlements flourished, providing stability and workforce continuity. Tools and techniques. Roman miners used picks, chisels, hammers, and wedges. Fire setting was common. Rocks were heated with fire, then cooled with water to fracture them. This technique required careful control. Too much heat, and the rock could shatter unpredictably. Too little, and it was useless. Romans also used levers, pulleys, and ramps underground to move heavy stones. Every tool and method was iterative, practical, effective, and adapted to the environment. Metallurgy as empire building. Metal wasn't just industrial, it was political. Coins reinforced imperial authority. Weapons ensured conquest. Tools allowed roads, bridges, and aqueducts to be built. Even luxury items, jewelry, silverware, and statuary displayed Roman control over resources and artisanship. The flow of metals was monitored carefully. Lead, silver, and gold were taxable, transportable, and strategically deployed. Mining and metallurgy weren't peripheral, they were central to Roman governance. Underground engineering and water management. Water was critical underground. Romans built aqueducts to divert rivers or channels to wash away debris. Wells, reservoirs, and drainage channels prevented flooding in deeper shafts. This coordination of water, labor, and mechanical assistance shows a sophisticated understanding of hydraulics applied beyond urban centers. Mining was not just digging, it was integrated engineering on a large scale. Environmental considerations, or lack thereof. Romans were pragmatic about environmental impact. Forests were cleared for fuel. Rivers diverted for hydraulic mining. Soil eroded in pursuit of metal wealth. There was little concern for sustainability, the goal was output. Yet the scale and complexity of Roman mining demonstrate remarkable logistical skill. They managed enormous operations without modern machinery, yet maintained some continuity over decades. Labor and organization. Mining required careful organization. Slaves, convicts, and hired laborers formed hierarchical teams. Engineers supervised water systems, furnace operations, and/or processing. The pace was relentless, yet efficient. Another instance of Rome converting human labor into systemic power. It's a quiet, grim kind of efficiency, essential, often invisible, but critical to empire building. Technological integration. Roman mining integrated multiple technologies. Mechanical systems, trip hammers, lifts, pulleys. Water management, sluices, channels, dewatering. Metallurgy, smelting, alloying, casting. Organization, labor management, supply chains, standardization. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to impress tourists. But it worked, reliably, consistently, and on a scale few civilizations could match. Legacy of Roman mining and metallurgy. Roman mining influenced medieval Europe and beyond. Techniques like water-powered or crushing, fire setting, and smelting were rediscovered or adapted. Standardized coinage and alloys informed economic and metallurgical practices for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated shafts, tunnels, and machinery remnants, proof of ingenuity under challenging conditions. Even centuries later, the idea of systematized mining, integrated with infrastructure and governance, owes much to Rome. Closing thoughts. Roman mining and metallurgy were quiet, relentless engines of empire. They supplied metal for roads, bridges, siege engines, weapons, baths, coins, and decoration. They combined human labor, water, and mechanical ingenuity underground in ways that remain impressive today. It's easy to admire aqueducts and amphitheaters from a distance, but the subterranean world of Roman engineering is equally fascinating. Rivers diverted, shafts dug, water channeled, and metals smelted, all in service of an empire that understood resources as power. Rome's legacy is not just in what we see above ground, but in the machines, channels, and labor systems quietly operating below it. Mining and metallurgy demonstrate that even unseen work, meticulously engineered, can sustain civilizations for centuries. And for anyone imagining themselves deep in a Roman mine, the sound of flowing water, striking metal, and echoing voices is a reminder. The empire ran as much underground as it did on its marble-paved streets. Chapter 10: Roman Agriculture, Irrigation, and Farm Machines. Rome didn't survive on conquest and engineering alone. It needed food. Lots of it. And feeding an empire of millions required more than simple farming. It required planning, irrigation, machinery, and a surprising amount of technical know-how. The Roman farm, not just plows and dirt. Roman farms, or villi rusticae, were surprisingly sophisticated. They combined fields, vineyards, orchards, livestock pens, mills, and sometimes small workshops. The primary crops were grains like wheat and barley, but olives, grapes, and vegetables were also cultivated extensively. Animals were raised for labor, food, and secondary products, milk, wool, and hides. Even in the countryside, Romans applied engineering principles. Fields were leveled, drainage channels dug, and irrigation carefully controlled. Irrigation and water management. Water was central to agricultural efficiency. Romans dug channels, constructed cisterns, and diverted streams to ensure steady supply during dry months. Gravity was the key. Water flowed along carefully calculated gradients, sometimes traveling kilometers from source to field. Some estates used water-lifting devices, like noria wheels or bucket chains, to bring water to higher terraces. It wasn't automated in the modern sense, but it allowed more land to be farmed, higher yields, and fewer risks from drought. Mills and mechanical assistance. Mills were as important in agriculture as they were in urban production. Water-powered mills ground grain efficiently, sometimes in multiples along a single river channel. Some estates even had animal-powered mills for grinding olives or pressing wine. Mechanical trip hammers, presses, and pulleys were used to crush olives, juice grapes, or process other crops. Rome essentially applied industrial principles to farming, human and animal labor augmented by mechanical advantage. Crop rotation and soil management. Romans understood that soil fertility wasn't infinite. They practiced crop rotation, grains in one season, legumes in another, sometimes fallowing land to restore nutrients. Manure from livestock was carefully applied to maintain fertility. It wasn't modern chemistry, but it worked. Fields remained productive for decades, sustaining urban populations and armies alike. Roads and supply chains. Farms were not isolated. Grain, wine, olive oil, and other products traveled along Rome's roads to urban centers. Warehouses, carts, and occasionally river barges facilitated transport. This system ensured that even cities hundreds of miles from agricultural regions received regular shipments. It's a quiet example of logistics. Without roads, irrigation, and storage, Rome's army and cities would have starved. Viticulture and winemaking. Wine was more than a beverage. It was a cultural staple. Vineyards required careful planning. Terraces, irrigation, and pruning ensured healthy plants. Mechanical presses, powered by animals or humans, extracted juice efficiently. Storage amphorae were designed to preserve wine, sometimes sealed with resin. Wine production shows how Roman engineering extended to pleasure as well as survival. It combined practical mechanics with aesthetic and cultural priorities, and occasionally overindulgence. Olive oil and food processing. Olives were pressed for oil using mechanical presses. Romans built levered presses, sometimes powered by animals, to extract maximum yield. The oil wasn't just food, it was fuel for lamps, cosmetics, and even religious rituals. Processing facilities were integrated into estates. Water channels, gravity-fed presses, and storage containers allowed smooth operation. It was small-scale industrialization applied to everyday life. Livestock and mechanized care. Animals were essential to farming. Oxen and horses plowed fields, donkeys transported goods, and chickens, pigs, and sheep provided food and materials. Romans built pens, feeding systems, and sometimes simple mechanical devices like automated grain dispensers. It wasn't high-tech by modern standards, but it reduced labor, improved efficiency, and allowed large estates to function reliably. Harvesting and labor organization. Harvesting was labor-intensive, but Romans applied organization and timing to improve efficiency. Workers were assigned tasks: cutting, gathering, threshing, and transporting. Threshing floors, often circular, allowed grain to be separated using animal-driven rotational motion or manual beating. Labor was hierarchical. Slaves, tenant farmers, and overseers coordinated closely. The scale of operation required careful planning. A delayed harvest could mean famine, while proper timing ensured surplus for storage or trade. Storage and preservation. Grain, wine, and oil were stored carefully. Granaries used raised floors, ventilation, and careful construction to prevent rot and pests. Amphorae and barrels kept liquid stable, sometimes sealed with pitch or clay. Storage was critical. Even the best irrigation and harvest could fail without proper preservation. Rome's engineering extended beyond production to safeguarding output, demonstrating the empire's holistic approach to infrastructure. Economic implications. Agriculture wasn't just survival, it was the economic engine. Taxes were often paid in kind, with grain or oil sent to Rome for distribution. Surplus crops fueled trade, supported urban populations, and financed armies. Mechanization and irrigation allowed more reliable yields, stabilizing both economy and governance. Rural innovation and experimentation. Wealthy Romans sometimes experimented with techniques. Different irrigation patterns. Novel plow designs. Crop rotation schedules. Early pest control methods. Innovation was driven by necessity and curiosity. Some villas became experimental agricultural centers, blending engineering, mechanics, and biology, centuries ahead of systematic agronomy. Integration with empire-wide systems. Agriculture relied on other Roman systems. Roads transported goods efficiently. Water management supported irrigation and mills. Standardization ensured consistent weights and measures for trade. Rome's approach shows that even rural technology was interconnected with urban, military, and industrial systems. It's an example of subtle but profound engineering. Agricultural productivity was not isolated, but part of a larger imperial network. Lessons from Roman farming technology. Roman agriculture shows how ingenuity extends beyond obvious engineering. Hydraulics weren't just for aqueducts and baths, they irrigated fields. Mills weren't just urban, they ground grain for rural communities. Organization, labor management, and mechanical assistance increased efficiency and reliability. It's a quiet demonstration that practical, incremental innovation can sustain an empire for centuries. Efficiency. Nothing was left to chance. Every bolt, wheel, and hinge was optimized for predictability. Ballistae, the Roman crossbow on steroids. The ballista was essentially a giant crossbow. Wooden frame, twisted sinew or rope acting as torsion springs. Iron-tipped bolts or stones. Ballistae were precise and powerful. Skilled crews could hit targets hundreds of meters away. Some ballistae were mounted on wheels for mobility, others were stationary, protecting walls or bases. It's fascinating to imagine the quiet tension before firing. Soldiers winding torsion ropes, adjusting aim, and releasing a bolt that could flatten a gate or a crowd of unsuspecting defenders. Onagers, the subtle catapult. The onager was a torsion catapult, a single arm with a sling or cup to hold stones. Twisted ropes providing energy, a release mechanism designed for maximum throw distance. It was slow to reload, but devastating for fortifications. The Romans developed techniques to stabilize the base, angle shots, and coordinate multiple engines for simultaneous bombardment. Military engineering emphasized reliability over flair. Precision was more important than drama. Siege towers and ladders. Tall wooden towers allowed soldiers to reach the top of walls safely. Wheels enabled slow approach. Platforms carried archers and engineers. Protective coverings minimized exposure to enemy fire. Ladders were simpler but still carefully designed. Length, weight, and spacing mattered. The combination of towers, ladders, and artillery created a coordinated approach. Direct assault, cover fire, and structural weakening all at once. Fortification breaching, rams and piles. Battering rams were classic tools. Suspended logs, often capped with iron, swung by teams of soldiers. Protected by wooden shelters called tortoises or testudos. Rams weakened gates and walls over time. Patience, rhythm, and coordination were essential. Even a small misalignment could break equipment or injure the crew. Romans emphasized training and precision. Mechanical innovation. Romans experimented with engineering subtleties. Counterweights for smoother catapult operation. Adjustable torsion systems for different projectile weights. Wooden frames reinforced with iron for durability. Early recoil management techniques. Some experiments failed. Many succeeded. The overarching principle: maximize damage while minimizing risk to operators. Logistics of siege warfare. Sieges weren't spontaneous. Engineers scouted terrain. Supply lines ensured materials for towers, engines, and ammunition. Temporary fortifications secured camps. Everything was coordinated. The silent, invisible work behind a siege often determined victory more than the engines themselves. A battle-ready army without logistical planning was simply a group of people with sticks and shields. Integration with Roman roads. Siege engines were heavy. Roads mattered. Ballistae, towers, and rams had to be transported efficiently. Roads allowed rapid redeployment. Bridges enabled crossing rivers to attack strategic locations. Rome's infrastructure was thus part of military success. Roads and bridges weren't civilian luxuries. They were strategic enablers. Training and standardization. Roman armies standardized siege technology. Templates for construction. Standard projectile sizes. Torsion spring calibration methods. Engineers trained alongside soldiers. Everyone understood the equipment and its limitations. It's a subtle but crucial point. The effectiveness of military machines depended on disciplined, coordinated human operation. Engineering under pressure. Siege warfare required quick thinking. If a wall was thicker than expected, machines had to adjust. Muddy terrain demanded temporary platforms or ramps. Enemy countermeasures forced adaptation. Romans approached these challenges systematically. Measurement, calculation, and incremental improvement. It wasn't glamorous, it was methodical, a hallmark of Roman engineering philosophy. Integration with artillery. Artillery didn't operate alone. Ballistae covered advancing soldiers. Onagers targeted towers or walls. Archers provided suppressive fire. Engineers coordinated rams, towers, and ramps. The result was a coordinated mechanical symphony, each part functioning in harmony to achieve the goal: capture the fortress efficiently. Hydraulic and mechanical ingenuity. In some cases, Romans experimented with early hydraulic principles. Water to slow defenders or create moats. Counterweight systems to amplify force. Simple mechanical cranes to lift stones or supplies. These innovations were subtle, quiet, and largely invisible to the enemy, but incredibly effective. Siege as engineering feat. A Roman siege is easy to imagine as chaos, fire, shouting, and flying stones. But in reality, it was more like a carefully timed machine. Precision construction of towers and rams. Calculated artillery placement. Coordinated troop movements. Supply chains maintaining ammunition and food. Victory relied less on bravery and more on quiet engineering and planning. Psychological effect. Siege engines weren't just physical tools, they were psychological instruments. Walls trembled under repeated blows. Stones arced predictably into enemy positions. The enemy could see the inevitability of destruction. Rome understood that engineering could dominate minds as well as walls. The subtle hum of machines became a tool of intimidation. Lessons from Roman military engineering. Roman siegecraft demonstrates. Engineering extends beyond construction. It's strategic. Coordination and training amplify mechanical effectiveness. Innovation is iterative, practical, and silent. Roman armies combined machinery, human labor, and logistical foresight into an integrated system. Siege engines weren't just weapons, they were mechanical expressions of Roman order and control. Closing thoughts. Roman military machines were quiet triumphs of precision and planning. Ballistae, onagers, rams, towers, and lifts operated seamlessly when coordinated. The real genius lay not in flashy destruction, but in reliable, repeatable, and predictable systems, engineering that worked as intended every time. From the hum of torsion springs to the slow swing of a ram, the Romans orchestrated war as much as they did infrastructure, agriculture, or entertainment. It's a reminder that empire building was as much mechanical and logistical as it was political or martial. Rome conquered not just through soldiers, but through the silent, subtle machinery of engineering applied to every aspect of life, even destruction. Chapter 13. Roman aqueducts, plumbing, and the hidden machines of water. Rome was thirsty. Not metaphorically, though the empire certainly had an appetite for conquest and marble. Physically thirsty. Millions of residents, baths, fountains, gardens, and workshops all required a steady, reliable water supply. And supplying that water meant engineering on a massive scale. Aqueducts, plumbing, and hidden distribution systems. Aqueducts, gravity as the primary engineer. Roman aqueducts weren't magical, they were precise applications of gravity. Water flowed downhill along channels, sometimes for tens of kilometers. Bridges, tunnels, and siphons maintained gradients. Concrete and stone-lined channels to prevent leakage. Messengers and riders. Couriers were the backbone of communication. Fast riders covered long distances using relays. Horses were swapped at stations to maintain speed. Messages were often written on wooden tablets or wax-coated surfaces for privacy. Riders operated under strict schedules. Efficiency mattered more than comfort. A single delayed courier could ripple across provinces, delaying decisions or supplies. Maritime communication. Rome also managed communication across water. Coastal signals for approaching ships. Beacon fires for distant warning. Couriers on vessels for trade, military, and administration. The empire was interconnected. Sea and land networks complemented each other. Maritime systems were slower than optical towers but essential for provincial integration. Administrative integration. Communication wasn't just for emergencies, it was bureaucratic. Tax collection notices, military orders, census data and official correspondence. Information flowed systematically through the same channels. Rome was a paper empire long before paper existed. Written orders, recorded inventories, and dispatched instructions all maintained cohesion. Secret communication. Sometimes subtlety mattered. Ciphers and codes protected sensitive messages. Couriers might disguise themselves as merchants or travelers. Visual signals were often cryptic to outsiders. Control over information was part of power. The infrastructure, roads, stations, and towers, was essential to maintain secrecy and reliability. Relay stations and human engineering. The cursus publicus depended on relay stations. Fresh horses for speed. Food and shelter for riders. Coordination to avoid congestion and delays. It's easy to overlook. The system wasn't just mechanical, but human engineered. People operated within rules, maintained schedules, and ensured redundancy, a living, functioning network. Standardization and planning. Messages required consistency. Standard routes. Predefined distances between stations. Clear writing conventions to avoid misinterpretation. Rome understood that networks fail not because of technology, but because of human error. Redundancy, training, and standardization minimized mistakes, ensuring messages arrived intact. Military coordination. On campaigns, communication could be life or death. Siege engines and formations relied on coordinated orders. Couriers relayed intelligence and reinforcements. Signal towers allowed rapid tactical adjustments. Roman generals could orchestrate complex maneuvers, partly because information traveled faster than armies themselves. Engineering movement of people was one thing, engineering movement of information was another, and Rome excelled at both. Integration with infrastructure. Communication networks relied on broader infrastructure. Roads ensured speed and reliability. Bridges and ferries allowed consistent routes. Stations and waypoints formed an invisible network. Without physical infrastructure, the flow of information would collapse. Information was mechanical in a sense. Relay systems, standardized routes, and disciplined execution created reliability from chaos. Psychological effect. Efficient communication reinforced authority. Governors received orders promptly. Citizens saw administrative efficiency. Soldiers trusted that support would arrive. Information was a form of power. The quiet, invisible systems made the empire appear omnipresent, a subtle but potent demonstration of control. Legacy of Roman communication. Rome's networks influenced later postal, relay, and courier systems. Medieval European couriers adopted relay principles. Military signaling inspired future optical telegraphs. Standardized scheduling foreshadowed modern postal logistics. It's remarkable how much modern infrastructure echoes Roman principles. Redundancy, relay, and network reliability. Lessons from Roman communication. The genius of Roman messaging systems was subtle. Infrastructure and logistics are inseparable from communication. Redundancy ensures reliability. Human and mechanical components must operate together. Visibility isn't necessary, reliability is. Information can be the quietest, most effective engine of power. Rome knew that control of roads, towers, and couriers equaled control of the empire. Closing thoughts. Rome's communication systems were invisible, yet indispensable. The cursus publicus, relay stations, visual signals, and maritime couriers formed a mechanical network spanning continents. Messages traveled faster than armies, decrees reached governors before crises escalated, and intelligence flowed systematically through the empire. The genius lies in subtlety. You rarely see the system at work, yet its effects are undeniable. The empire survived not just on soldiers or aqueducts, but on the quiet, meticulously engineered movement of information. Rome's roads, riders, towers, and relay stations were its silent networks, invisible machines of governance that connected an entire civilization. Chapter 15. Roman Entertainment Engineering. Amphitheaters, stages, and spectacle machines. Rome loved spectacle. Not the quiet kind of storybook spectacle, but immersive, engineered, and perfectly orchestrated entertainment. And behind every gladiator's swing, chariot race, or mock naval battle, there was engineering, quiet, subtle, and often unnoticed. The amphitheater, a machine for spectacle. The Roman amphitheater was more than a building. It was a mechanical system for moving thousands of people efficiently and safely. Tiered seating with precise sightlines. Entrances and exits to avoid bottlenecks. Trapdoors, elevators, and tunnels for performers and animals. Consider the Colosseum. Could hold over 50,000 spectators. Seating arranged by social hierarchy, everyone saw what they were supposed to. Complex underground chambers, called hypogeum, managed animals, scenery, and props. The amphitheater was as much a machine for moving people as it was for hosting combat. The hypogeum, underground engineering marvel. Beneath the arena floor lay the hypogeum, a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and elevators. Pulley systems lifted animals or scenery into the arena. Trapdoors allowed surprise entrances for dramatic effect. Corridors facilitated smooth movement for performers and staff. It's easy to overlook. While spectators focused on the spectacle, a quiet mechanical orchestra operated below. The system required coordination, timing, and a keen understanding of weights, pulleys, and human labor. Valeria, the giant awning. Spectators weren't always comfortable. The sun could be brutal. A retractable canvas, called valerium, shaded the audience. Sailors or specialized crews managed ropes, pulleys, and support masts. The system allowed quick adjustments depending on wind or sun position. Its subtle engineering, wind, weight, and motion controlled by humans to improve comfort. A mechanical problem disguised as leisure. Stages and skene, the theater as machine. In Roman theaters, scenery and backdrops were often movable. Stage machinery allowed actors to appear and disappear. Trapdoors and lifts added dramatic surprises. Some stages incorporated water features or miniature mechanical devices to simulate battles or natural phenomena. The theater was both performance space and subtle mechanical workshop. Streets and public spaces were swept, drained, and maintained. Rome's sanitation was quiet but effective. Citizens walked, bathed, and lived without realizing the complex systems maintaining hygiene beneath their feet. Medicine in daily life. Medical knowledge intersected with household practices. Herbs, poultices, and balms were common. Clean water, air, and diet were encouraged. Baths, exercise, and massage were part of routine health. The Roman approach was subtle, prevention through environment, hygiene, and lifestyle, augmented by medical intervention when necessary. Early public health administration. Officials monitored water, waste, and hygiene. Aqueduct inspectors ensured clean supply. Sewer maintenance prevented blockages. Public bath attendants managed flow, temperature, and cleanliness. Even without modern epidemiology, the Romans applied systemic thinking. They treated the city as a living machine. Water, waste, and people all moving in controlled, regulated flows. Hospitals and specialized care. Military hospitals weren't the only specialized facilities. Some temples offered healing services. Physicians in urban centers treated the wealthy and influential. Pharmacological knowledge included herbal remedies, ointments, and dietary prescriptions. Treatment was practical, systematic, and often ritualized, blending mechanical precision with cultural expectations. Integration with infrastructure. Medical and sanitation systems were interconnected. Water supply supported baths, latrines, and hygiene. Roads enabled transport of doctors, patients, and medical supplies. Warehouses stored herbs, instruments, and consumables. Rome engineered health into the city fabric. Invisible, silent, and reliable systems kept citizens functional, often without awareness of the complexity involved. Disease management and prevention. Romans practiced rudimentary epidemiology, quarantining infected areas, regulating water and food supply. encouraging cleanliness in public and private spaces. It wasn't perfect, but systemic prevention minimized outbreaks. Sanitation, infrastructure, and subtle medical oversight acted like mechanical interventions to stabilize urban life. Lessons from Roman medicine and sanitation. Rome's approach teaches several principles. Health can be engineered through infrastructure. Preventive systems often work better than reactive solutions. Subtle, invisible machines, sewers, aqueducts, baths, impact millions of lives quietly. Integration of technology, human labor, and planning magnifies effect. The Romans didn't have germ theory, but they had systems thinking, designing processes and infrastructure to maintain health across an empire. Closing thoughts. Roman medicine and sanitation were invisible, quiet, and effective. From the flowing aqueducts to the organized military hospitals, the empire operated a subtle machinery of health. Water moved, waste disappeared, baths circulated warmth, and physicians intervened systematically. The genius lies in integration. Infrastructure, mechanical systems, and procedural knowledge combined to sustain life in a crowded city. Rome didn't just conquer, it preserved, maintained, and quietly optimized human health. Invisible machines beneath streets, beneath baths, and inside hospitals kept the city alive, a silent testament to the empire's practical genius.